30 years ago, a son walked away from his mother, leaving her heartbroken and bewildered. For 3 long decades, she wondered why her beloved boy had vanished from her life without a trace. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Today, I'm going to share with you a story that will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the most painful decisions are made out of the deepest love. This is the story of Margaret Thompson and her son David, a tale of sacrifice, protection, and a reunion that nobody saw coming. But before we dive into this incredible journey, let me ask you something. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice? One where every option seemed wrong, but you had to choose anyway? Keep that feeling in mind as I tell you what happened on that cold February morning in 1995, when David Thompson walked out of his mother's life forever. The abandonment. Margaret Thompson was 52 years old when her world fell apart. She had raised David as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when the boy was only 8. For 14 years, it had been just the two of them against the world. Margaret worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet, but she never complained. David was her everything, her pride, her joy, her reason for getting up every morning. David was 22 then, fresh out of college with a degree in engineering. He had landed his first real job at a consulting firm downtown, and Margaret couldn't have been prouder. She had scrimped and saved every penny to help him through school, sometimes going without meals herself to make sure he had what he needed. They lived in a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, the same house where David had taken his first steps, lost his first tooth, and graduated high school as valedictorian. The walls were covered with his achievements: honor roll certificates, baseball trophies, graduation photos. Margaret's face would light up every time she showed visitors around, pointing out each milestone with the pride only a mother knows. But something had been different about David in those final weeks. Margaret noticed he seemed distracted, anxious even. He would get phone calls that made him pace the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. When she asked about it, he would just say it was work-related stress. She believed him because she trusted him completely. After all, this was the son who had never lied to her, who called her every day from college, who brought her flowers on Mother's Day without fail. Then came that February morning. Margaret was in the kitchen making David's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. But instead of his usual cheerful, "Morning, Mom," she was met with silence. David stood in the doorway, fully dressed in his best suit, carrying a single suitcase. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed as if he hadn't slept all night. Margaret's heart immediately knew something was terribly wrong. "David, honey, what's going on? Are you going somewhere for work?" He couldn't meet her eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the sizzling of pancakes on the griddle. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would haunt Margaret for the next 30 years. "Mom, I have to go and I can't come back." Margaret's hand went to her chest. "What do you mean you can't come back? David, you're scaring me. What's happened? I can't explain it. I need you to know that I love you more than anything in this world. Everything I've done, everything I'm about to do, it's because I love you. David, please, talk to me. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it together. We always have." But David was already moving toward the door. Margaret followed him, her voice rising in panic. "David, David, please don't do this. Don't leave me like this." He paused at the front door, his hand on the handle. For a moment, Margaret thought he would turn around, that he would come back and explain everything. Instead, he said, "Forget about me, Mom. It's better this way." And then he was gone. Margaret stood on her front porch in her bathrobe and slippers, watching her son's car disappear around the corner. She called his name until her voice was hoarse, but he never looked back. The neighbors probably thought she was having a breakdown, and maybe she was. Life without him. The days that followed were the darkest of Margaret's life. She called David's work, but they said he had resigned effective immediately. She called his friends, but they claimed they hadn't heard from him. It was as if David Thompson had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Margaret filed a missing persons report, but David was an adult, and there was no evidence of foul play. The police told her that people sometimes just needed to start fresh, that he would probably contact her when he was ready. But Margaret knew her son. This wasn't about starting fresh. Something was very, very wrong. She hired a private investigator with money she didn't have, money that should have gone to groceries and utilities. The investigator traced David to Chicago, then to Denver, then lost the trail completely. It was as if he was deliberately covering his tracks, staying one step ahead of anyone trying to find him. Margaret's friends and family tried to be supportive, But as the months turned to years, their patience wore thin. "You need to move on," they would say. "He's made his choice. You can't spend your whole life waiting for someone who doesn't want to be found." But they didn't understand. David wasn't just her son. He was her purpose, her legacy, her heart walking around outside her body. How do you move on from that? Margaret kept David's room exactly as he left it. His engineering textbook still sat on the desk where he had studied for finals. His baseball glove still hung from the bedpost. His high school yearbook was still open to the page where his classmates had written messages about their bright futures together. Every year on his birthday, Margaret would bake a cake and sit alone at the kitchen table singing "Happy Birthday" to an empty chair. Every Christmas she would wrap a present for him, just in case this was the year he came home. The presents accumulated in his closet, 20, 25, 30, carefully wrapped boxes that no one would ever open. Margaret aged more than the calendar suggested. The vibrant woman who had once juggled 3 jobs while raising a son became a shadow of herself. Her hair turned white, her shoulders stooped, her eyes lost their sparkle. She still worked at the diner, but her regulars noticed she didn't smile as much anymore. She never remarried, never even dated. How could she? Part of her would always be waiting, always listening for the sound of David's key in the front door, always hoping that today would be the day he remembered he had a mother who loved him. The holidays were the worst. Margaret would watch other families gathered around dinner tables, children and grandchildren laughing and sharing stories, and she would feel the absence of David like a physical pain. She would wonder where he was spending Christmas, if he was alone, if he ever thought about the woman who used to read him bedtime stories and kiss his scraped knees. Margaret's health began to suffer. The stress of not knowing where David was, if he was safe, if he was happy, if he was even alive, took its toll. She developed high blood pressure, then diabetes, then heart problems. Her doctor prescribed medication for depression, but how do you medicate a mother's broken heart? Some nights Margaret would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying that last morning over and over again. She analyzed every word David had said, every expression on his face, searching for clues she might have missed. "Forget about me, Mom. It's better this way." What could possibly be better about a son abandoning his mother? Margaret's sister Ruth would visit every Sunday, bringing groceries and gentle lectures about letting go. "Margaret, honey, you're killing yourself over this. David made his choice. You have to make yours. You still have life to live." But Margaret couldn't see it that way. David wasn't a choice she had made. He was a part of her soul. You don't choose to forget your soul. Years passed. Margaret watched her neighbors' children grow up, get married, have children of their own. She attended baby showers and graduation parties, always with a smile plastered on her face, always wondering if David had achieved any milestones she would never know about. Did he get married? Did she have grandchildren she would never meet? Was he successful in his career? Was he happy? The questions tormented her, but she had no answers. Margaret started volunteering at the local hospital, reading to elderly patients who had no visitors. She found comfort in caring for other people's forgotten family members, but it also reminded her daily of her own loss. She would look at the lonely faces in those hospital beds and wonder if David would visit her when she was old and sick, or if she would die as alone as she lived. The 20th anniversary of David's disappearance passed, then the 25th. Margaret had become something of a local legend, the woman who never stopped waiting for her son. Some people admired her loyalty, others thought she was foolish. Margaret didn't care what people thought. Love isn't logical, and a mother's love is the most illogical of all. Margaret's hair had turned completely silver now and she walked with a cane. Her house on Maple Street had become a shrine to a son who might as well have been dead, but Margaret refused to believe he was dead. Somehow she would have known. A mother would feel it if her child left this world. The mystery deepens. As Margaret entered her 70s, she began to have moments of doubt. What if everyone was right? What if David simply didn't want her in his life? What if she had been a terrible mother and was too blind to see it? The thoughts crept in during her darkest moments, usually late at night when the house felt especially empty. But then she would remember the David she knew, the little boy who would crawl into her bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who worked part-time jobs to help with household expenses, the young man who had hugged her so tightly at his college graduation that she could barely breathe. That David would never abandon her without a reason. Margaret started having health scares. A mini-stroke at 74, a heart episode at 76. Each time she would lie in the hospital bed thinking about David, wondering if he would somehow sense that she needed him. But the phone never rang, and no familiar face ever appeared in her doorway. Ruth had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving Margaret more alone than ever. The house on Maple Street felt enormous now, every room echoing with memories of the family that used to live there. Margaret considered selling it dozens of times, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. What if David came back and she wasn't there? Margaret's 80th birthday arrived with little fanfare. A few neighbors stopped by with cake and flowers, but the celebration felt hollow. She sat in her living room that evening, surrounded by cards from people who barely knew her, and wondered if David even remembered it was her birthday. That's when something extraordinary happened. As Margaret was getting ready for bed, she heard a sound that stopped her heart, the sound of a car pulling into her driveway. Margaret's hands shook as she made her way to the front window. It had been so many years since anyone had visited her after dark. Through the sheer curtains, she could see headlights illuminating her front yard, but she couldn't make out the car or its occupant. A car door slammed. Footsteps on the walkway. Margaret's breath came in short gasps as she waited, hardly daring to hope, terrified to be disappointed again. Then came a knock on the door, not the aggressive knocking of a stranger, but a gentle, almost hesitant tap. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way to the front door, her cane clicking against the hardwood floor. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely steady. Silence. Then, a voice she hadn't heard in 30 years but would recognize anywhere. "Mom? It's me. It's David." The beginning of revelation. Margaret's legs gave out. She had to grab the doorframe to keep from falling, her cane clattering to the floor. For a moment she wondered if she was having another stroke, if her mind was finally giving her the hallucination she had longed for all these years. "Mom, are you okay? Please open the door." It was really him. After 30 years of silence, David was standing on her front porch. With trembling hands, Margaret unlocked the door. She'd imagined this moment thousands of times, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. David stood before her, no longer the young man who had left, but a middle-aged stranger with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a weariness about him that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. But those eyes, those were still her David's eyes. "Hello, Mom." Margaret couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the sun she had thought she might never see again. David's own eyes were filled with tears. "I know you have questions. I know you're angry. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you." "David?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" "It's really me, Mom." Margaret reached out a shaking hand to touch his face, as if to convince herself he was real. David leaned into her touch, closing his eyes as tears spilled down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Margaret's own tears came then. 30 years worth of grief and longing and hope finally released. She pulled her son into her arms, and despite everything, the years of silence, the unanswered questions, the pain he had caused, it felt like coming home. They held each other on the front porch for what felt like hours, two people trying to bridge 3 decades with an embrace. Finally, Margaret pulled back to look at him again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you leave me?" David's face crumpled. "Because I had to. Because it was the only way to keep you safe." "Safe? Safe from what?" "Come inside, Mom. Let me tell you everything." They sat at the same kitchen table where they had shared countless meals, where David had done his homework, where Margaret had waited every morning for 30 years hoping he would appear. David looked around the kitchen, and Margaret saw him notice that nothing had changed. The same curtains, the same dishes, even the same sugar bowl his father had given her for their first anniversary. "You kept everything the same," David said softly. "I kept hoping you'd come home." David closed his eyes, the weight of his mother's faithfulness clearly overwhelming him. "Mom, what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to believe, and it's going to be hard to hear. I don't care how hard it is. I've been waiting 30 years for an explanation." David took a deep breath, and Margaret could see him gathering courage for what was clearly a difficult story. "Do you remember my last semester in college? I had that internship with Henderson Engineering." Margaret nodded. She remembered being so proud that David had been selected for such a prestigious program. "What I didn't tell you was that the internship wasn't just about engineering. Henderson had government contracts, military projects, classified stuff. I was young and ambitious, and when they offered me a full-time position working on sensitive projects, I jumped at the chance." "What kind of projects?" "Infrastructure security." We were analyzing vulnerabilities in power grids, water systems, communication networks. The work was important, but it also made me privy to information that certain people didn't want exposed. Margaret frowned. This wasn't the explanation she had expected. About 6 months into the job, I discovered something I wasn't supposed to see. Some of the projects weren't about protecting infrastructure. They were about exploiting weaknesses. There were people within the company, people with connections to some very dangerous individuals who were using our research for the wrong purposes. David's hands shook as he spoke, and Margaret could see the fear he had carried for 30 years. I tried to go through proper channels. I reported what I had found to my supervisor, then to his supervisor, but instead of investigating, they told me to forget what I had seen and focus on my assigned tasks. But you couldn't forget. No, I couldn't. These people were planning to use our research to attack the very systems we were supposed to protect. Innocent people could die. I couldn't be part of that. Margaret felt a chill run through her. Her son, her gentle boy who had once cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant, had stumbled into something dark and dangerous. So I started gathering evidence. I copied files, recorded conversations, documented everything I could. I thought if I could put together a strong enough case, I could take it to the FBI or the media. Did you? David shook his head. I never got the chance. They found out what I was doing. The shocking truth. Margaret's kitchen suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. What do you mean they found out? David's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. One night I was working late at the office, copying the last of the files I needed. I thought I was alone, but my supervisor, Richard Henderson, walked in on me. Margaret could see her son reliving that moment, the fear still fresh in his eyes after all these years. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching me copy classified documents. Then he smiled, this cold, terrible smile, and said, David, I think we need to have a conversation. What happened then? He took me to his office and made it very clear what my options were. I could forget everything I had seen, destroy the evidence I had gathered, and continue working for the company with a substantial pay raise and promotion. Or, David's voice trailed off, and Margaret felt her heart sink. Or what, sweetheart? Or they would make sure I disappeared, but not before they made sure you disappeared first. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Me? Henderson knew everything about me, Mom. He knew about Dad's accident, about how hard you worked to put me through school, about how much you meant to me. He showed me photographs of you at work, at the grocery store, at home. They had been watching you, learning your routines. Margaret's hands flew to her throat. They threatened me? Henderson said that if I tried to expose what I had learned, or if I went to the authorities, or if I even talked about it to anyone, they would kill you, and they would make sure I knew it was my fault. The full horror of David's situation began to dawn on Margaret. Her son hadn't abandoned her. He had sacrificed everything to protect her. But David, you could have told me. We could have gone to the police together. David shook his head sadly. Mom, these weren't ordinary criminals. Henderson had connections everywhere. Law enforcement, government agencies, private security firms. He showed me examples of other people who had tried to cross them, people who had accidents or simply vanished. Margaret felt sick. So you agreed to their terms? I had no choice, but I couldn't stay and pretend nothing had happened. I couldn't work for people who were planning to hurt innocent people, and I couldn't live with the constant fear that one wrong move would put you in danger. So you left. I left. I took the coward's way out and ran, leaving you to think I had abandoned you. Henderson said as long as I stayed away from you and kept my mouth shut, you would be safe. So that's what I did. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she finally understood the sacrifice her son had made. Oh, David, all these years I thought you didn't love me anymore. Mom, leaving you nearly killed me. Every day for 30 years I've wanted to call you, to come home, to tell you the truth, but I couldn't risk your life. Where did you go? What did you do? David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I went to California first, then Oregon. I changed my name, paid cash for everything, stayed off the grid as much as possible. I worked construction jobs, restaurant work, anything that would pay under the table. You changed your name? I became Daniel Thompson, close enough to my real name that I would respond to it, different enough that it would be harder to trace. I've been Daniel for 30 years. Margaret tried to imagine her educated, ambitious son working menial jobs, living in the shadows, all to keep her safe. Did you ever marry? Have children? David's face grew even sadder. How could I? I couldn't build a life with someone based on lies. And I couldn't risk having a family that Henderson's people could use against me. So you've been alone all this time? I've been alone all this time. The sacrifice was so enormous, so complete, that Margaret could barely comprehend it. Her son had given up everything, his career, his family, his future, his very identity, to protect her. But David, why are you here now? What's changed? David reached across the table and took his mother's hands in his. They were calloused now, the hands of a man who had worked with his back instead of his brain. Henderson died 6 months ago. Heart attack. Most of his associates have either died or been arrested on other charges over the years. The company dissolved 15 years ago. The threat is finally gone, Mom. You're sure? I hired investigators to check. I've been watching from a distance, making sure it was really over before I came home. The people who threatened us are either dead, in prison, or too old to care about a 30-year-old grudge. Margaret looked at her son, this stranger who was still her baby, and felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the threat was over, joy that he was home, grief for all the years they had lost, and an overwhelming love for the man who had sacrificed his entire life to keep her safe. I don't know what to say, Margaret whispered. Say you can forgive me. Say it's not too late for us to have some kind of relationship. I know I can never make up for the 30 years I stole from us, but maybe we can have whatever time is left. The emotional climax. Margaret stood up from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. David watched anxiously as she walked around the table to where he sat. For a moment, she just looked down at him. This man who had once been her little boy, who had made an impossible choice out of love. Then she wrapped her arms around him, holding him as tightly as her aged body would allow. There's nothing to forgive, she whispered into his hair. You saved my life, David. You gave up everything to save my life. David broke down then, 30 years of suppressed grief and guilt pouring out in great racking sobs. Margaret held him and rocked him as she had when he was small, murmuring the same soothing words she had used to comfort him after nightmares. It's okay, baby. It's okay. You're home now. You're safe. We're both safe. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and son, healing wounds that had festered for 3 decades. When David finally composed himself, Margaret sat back down, but she kept hold of his hands. I have so many questions, she said. I have answers. All of them. Did you ever try to check on me? To see if I was okay? David nodded. I hired private investigators over the years, people who could check on you without being traced back to me. I knew about your health problems, your surgeries. I knew Ruth passed away. I knew you never remarried. You've been watching over me all this time. From a distance. It was torture, Mom. Knowing you were struggling. Knowing you were alone. And not being able to help. There were times I almost broke. When you had your heart episode 3 years ago, I drove all the way here. I sat in the hospital parking lot for hours, wanting so badly to come inside. Margaret's heart ached for her son, for the pain he had endured in silence. I left flowers on Dad's grave every year on the anniversary of his death, David continued. I figured you would think they were from the cemetery maintenance crew. Margaret gasped. Those were from you? I always wondered who left those yellow roses. Dad's favorite. I remembered. And my birthday. Every year I would find a card in my mailbox with no return address. That was me too. I couldn't sign them, but I couldn't let your birthday pass without acknowledging it somehow. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face again. Even in exile, even while protecting her from a distance, David had found ways to show his love. All these years, I thought I had failed as a mother. I thought I had done something to drive you away. Mom, you were perfect. You are perfect. You gave me everything I needed to become a man of integrity, and that integrity is what made it impossible for me to go along with Henderson's plans. You taught me right from wrong, and when I was faced with an impossible situation, I chose what I thought was right. Margaret squeezed his hands. You chose love. You chose to protect the person you loved most, even though it cost you everything. I would do it again, David said without hesitation. Your safety was worth more than my happiness. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the successful engineer he might have been, but something far more precious. She saw a man who had proven his love through sacrifice, who had chosen her welfare over his own desires, who had lived 30 years in exile rather than put her at risk. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. David's eyes widened in surprise. Proud of me? Mom, I abandoned you. I left you to suffer alone for 30 years. You saved me, David. You gave up your whole life to save mine. What could make a mother prouder than knowing her son would sacrifice everything to keep her safe? They talked through the night, filling in 30 years of missing pieces. Margaret learned about David's life in exile, the loneliness, the constant vigilance, the sacrifice of every dream he had ever had. David learned about Margaret's life of waiting, the hope that sustained her, the love that never wavered, the faith that someday her son would come home. As the sun began to rise over Maple Street, Margaret made her son breakfast, the same blueberry pancakes she had been making 30 years ago when he left. But this time, there was no sadness, no fear, no goodbye hanging in the air. This time there was only love, forgiveness, and the promise of whatever time they had left. Reflection and resolution. In the days that followed David's return, neighbors began to notice changes at the Thompson house on Maple Street. For the first time in 30 years, there were 2 cars in the driveway. The windows that had been dark for so long now glowed warmly in the evenings. Margaret, who had walked with a stooped posture for years, suddenly stood straighter, her step lighter. David had rented a small apartment across town, but he spent most of his time at his childhood home, helping his mother with repairs and maintenance that had been neglected over the years. They worked together in comfortable silence, making up for lost conversations with shared tasks and gentle touches. Margaret's health, which had been declining for years, seemed to improve almost overnight. Her doctor was amazed at her sudden vitality, the color that had returned to her cheeks, the sparkle that was back in her eyes. It's like she has something to live for again, her doctor told David during one of Margaret's checkups. I've seen this before with elderly patients. Sometimes the medicine they need most can't be found in a prescription bottle. David had decided to stay in Columbus permanently. He couldn't reclaim his old career. Too many years had passed, too much had changed. But he found work as a consultant for small engineering firms, his experience and skills still valuable despite the long gap in his resume. More importantly, he found peace. For 30 years, David had lived with the constant fear that Henderson's people would find him, that his mother would pay the price for his defiance. Now, for the first time since he was 22 years old, David Thompson could sleep through the night without nightmares. Margaret threw away the medication she had been taking for depression. She no longer needed it. Her son was home, and that was the only antidepressant that mattered. They established new traditions together. Sunday dinners became sacred, just the 2 of them sharing stories and making new memories. David helped Margaret plant a garden in the backyard, something she had always wanted to do but couldn't manage alone. Margaret finally opened David's room, which had remained a shrine to his youth for 30 years. Together they sorted through his old belongings, keeping what mattered and donating the rest. The room was transformed into a comfortable space where David could stay when he visited, which was often. The most precious moments came when Margaret would show David the presents she had wrapped for him each Christmas, 30 boxes of love that had waited patiently in his closet. Most were outdated now, clothing in sizes he had outgrown, electronics that had become obsolete, books he might have enjoyed as a young man. But David treasured each one, understanding that they represented 30 years of a mother's unwavering hope. Margaret also showed him the photo albums she had continued to maintain, even without new pictures of David to add. She had collected newspaper clippings about engineering achievements, thinking of the career her son might have had. She had saved articles about young men who were making a difference in the world, imagining David among them. I never stopped believing you were out there doing good things, Margaret told him as they looked through the albums together. I knew my son was making the world a better place somehow. I wasn't doing anything remarkable, Mom. I was just surviving. You were protecting your mother. In my book, that makes you a hero. David struggled with accepting his mother's forgiveness and admiration. 30 years of guilt and self-recrimination couldn't be erased overnight. He had expected anger, resentment, or at least disappointment. Instead, he found unconditional love and overwhelming pride. I don't deserve your forgiveness, David said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset. Love doesn't work that way, sweetheart. I didn't stop loving you when you left, and I didn't love you less during all those years of silence. Love isn't something you earn or lose based on your actions. It just is. But I hurt you so badly. You protected me. Yes, I was hurt by your absence. But I understand now that my pain was the price of my safety. You paid a much higher price than I did. Margaret reached over and took her son's hand. David, I need you to forgive yourself. I need you to understand that what you did was brave and selfless and loving. Don't dishonor that sacrifice by continuing to punish yourself. It took time, But gradually, David began to heal from the trauma of his exile. Margaret's unwavering love and acceptance slowly eroded the guilt and shame he had carried for so long. He began to see his actions through his mother's eyes, not as abandonment, but as protection, not as cowardice, but as courage. 6 months after David's return, Margaret had a mild heart episode. Nothing serious, the doctors assured them, but it served as a reminder that time was precious and uncertain. David barely left her side during her hospital stay, terrified that he might lose her just when he had gotten her back. "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret assured him from her hospital bed. "I've waited 30 years for you to come home. I'm going to stick around and enjoy having you back." Margaret recovered fully, but the scare motivated both of them to make the most of their time together. They took a trip to Niagara Falls, something Margaret had always wanted to do. They visited David's father's grave together for the first time since the funeral, David finally able to stand beside his mother as she talked to the husband she still missed. They attended church together, Margaret proudly introducing her son to people who had prayed for his return for decades. The congregation welcomed David with open arms, understanding that sometimes miracles take 30 years to manifest. The new beginning. A year after David's return, Margaret celebrated her 81st birthday surrounded by more joy than she had felt in 3 decades. David had organized a small party with their closest neighbors and friends, people who had supported Margaret through her long years of waiting. "I have an announcement to make," Margaret said as she prepared to blow out her candles. "This past year has been the best year of my life, and I'm not just talking about having David back." She looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her extended family, the neighbors who had checked on her during storms, the church friends who had brought her meals when she was sick, the postal worker who had delivered those anonymous birthday cards with such care. "I realized that while I was waiting for my son, I was also being taken care of by all of you. You became my family when I thought I had none. You gave me reasons to keep going when I wanted to give up. David, you're not the only hero in this story." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Margaret continued. "I also realized that our story isn't just about a son who came home. It's about the power of love to endure anything. Separation, time, fear, even the threat of death. It's about faith, not just in God, but in each other." Margaret looked directly at David. "And it's about forgiveness. Not just my forgiving you, but you forgiving yourself and both of us forgiving the circumstances that kept us apart." David stood up and hugged his mother as the small gathering applauded. "Thank you, Mom, for never giving up, for never stopping loving me, and for teaching me what unconditional love really means. Thank you for coming home, sweetheart. Thank you for giving us this chance to be a family again." 2 years later, Margaret and David had settled into a comfortable routine. David had moved back into his childhood home, taking care of the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. Margaret's health had stabilized, her spirits were high, and she often said she felt younger at 82 than she had at 62. They had both learned not to take their time together for granted. Every shared meal, every conversation, every moment of companionship was treasured. They had also learned that love truly is stronger than time, stronger than distance, stronger than fear. David never remarried, but he found fulfillment in caring for his mother and reconnecting with the community he had left behind. He volunteered at the local high school helping students with engineering and math, passing on the knowledge he had gained through his unconventional career path. Margaret became something of a local celebrity, not for her 30-year wait, but for her message of hope and forgiveness. She spoke at women's groups and church gatherings, sharing her story and encouraging others never to give up on love. "People ask me how I waited 30 years without losing hope," Margaret would say. "The answer is simple. I never really lost him. Yes, he was physically absent, but he was always in my heart, always in my prayers, always in my thoughts. That kind of presence doesn't disappear just because someone walks out the door." Margaret would often end her talks with the same message. Love isn't about never being separated. Love is about choosing to remain connected despite the separation. David and I were apart for 30 years, but we were never truly separated. Love kept us connected across time and distance. The lasting impact. The story of Margaret and David Thompson became more than just a local tale of reunion. Word spread through social media and community networks, touching hearts across the country. People who heard their story were inspired to reach out to estranged family members, to forgive old hurts, to believe in the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Margaret received hundreds of letters from people who had been touched by her story. Some were from mothers waiting for their own prodigal children. Others were from children who had been inspired to reconcile with parents they had disappointed or abandoned. Still others were from people who simply needed to believe that love could triumph over circumstances. One letter that particularly moved Margaret came from a woman in California whose son had left home under mysterious circumstances 20 years earlier. "Reading your story gave me hope that I'm not foolish to keep waiting," the woman wrote. "I'm not foolish to keep believing that love will bring him home. Thank you for showing me that 30 years of faith can be rewarded. I'm going to keep waiting, and I'm going to keep loving." David also received letters, many from people who were struggling with impossible choices of their own. Young people facing moral dilemmas, parents trying to protect their children, individuals caught between loyalty and integrity. "Your story reminds me that sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice," one young man wrote. "That sometimes love requires sacrifice, and that sacrifice doesn't diminish love. It proves it." Margaret and David realized that their personal story had become something larger, a testament to values that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. Their experience spoke to the enduring power of family bonds, the importance of moral courage, and the belief that doing the right thing, even when it costs everything, is always worth it. 3 years after David's return, Margaret suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on her left side. David took early retirement to become her full-time caregiver, repaying the sacrifice she had made for him during his childhood. "I should be taking care of you," Margaret protested weakly from her hospital bed. "Mom, you took care of me for 22 years. Then you waited for me for 30 more. It's my turn to take care of you." David moved Margaret's bed to the living room so she could see the garden they had planted together. He read to her daily, cooked her favorite meals, and helped her with the physical therapy that gradually restored some of her mobility. Margaret's speech was slightly slurred, but her mind remained sharp, and her spirit remained strong. She continued to receive visitors who wanted to hear her story, and David would help her tell it, filling in details when her words came slowly. "The most important thing," Margaret would tell her visitors, "is to never stop believing in love, even when it seems hopeless, even when everyone tells you to give up, even when you start to doubt yourself. Don't stop loving. Love has a power that defies logic, that transcends circumstances, that can work miracles." Final reflection. Margaret Thompson lived to see her 85th birthday, celebrated once again in the living room of the house on Maple Street, where she had waited so patiently for her son's return. David was by her side, as he had been every day for the past 5 years, caring for the woman who had given him everything. The party was small but joyful, attended by the same neighbors and friends who had supported Margaret through her darkest years and celebrated with her during her brightest. As Margaret looked around the room, she felt a deep sense of completeness. "I want to thank everyone for coming," Margaret said, her voice weaker now but still filled with warmth. "I also want to thank God for giving me more time with my son than I ever expected to have." She turned to David, who was sitting beside her wheelchair holding her hand. "People think our story is unusual, but I don't think it is. I think love like ours exists in families everywhere. Maybe not everyone faces the extreme circumstances we faced, but every parent loves their child enough to make sacrifices. Every child, if they're lucky, knows they are loved unconditionally." Margaret paused, gathering her strength for her final thoughts. "The unusual thing about our story isn't the love. It's the circumstances that tested that love. David was forced to choose between his happiness and my safety. I was forced to choose between despair and hope. We both chose love, in different ways, and love brought us back together. What I want people to remember about our story is this: love is not a feeling you fall into and out of. Love is a choice you make every day. David chose to love me by protecting me even though it broke his heart. I chose to love him by believing in him, even when I didn't understand why he had left." Margaret looked around the room one more time. "Love is patient. Love is faithful. Love endures all things. Love never fails." David and I are living proof of that truth. 2 months later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, with David holding her hand. Her last words to him were, "Thank you for coming home, sweetheart. Thank you for giving me the chance to love you the way you deserve to be loved." David buried his mother next to his father in the cemetery, where he had left anonymous flowers for 30 years. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's story of unwavering love and faithful waiting. After the service, David stood at his parents' graveside, finally able to grieve openly for all the losses he had endured: his father's early death, the 30 years of separation from his mother, and now her peaceful passing. But there was also gratitude, Gratitude for the 5 precious years they had been given together. Gratitude for a mother who had loved him enough to wait 30 years for his return. Gratitude for the opportunity to prove his love by caring for her in her final years. David continued to live in the house on Maple Street, maintaining it as a testament to the love that had filled its rooms. He kept Margaret's garden growing, continued her tradition of volunteering at the hospital, and shared their story with anyone who needed to hear a message of hope. This story moved you because it reminds us that love, real, unconditional, sacrificial love, still exists in this world. It shows us that sometimes the people who hurt us are actually protecting us, and sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest sacrifices. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love, and tell us, have you ever experienced a reunion that changed everything? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between your own happiness and someone else's safety? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.